Welcome to this video about potential causes of cardiovascular inflammation. To contextualize this, let's just recap about what I shared in previous videos about the topic. I talked about how cholesterol doesn't cause cardiovascular disease, and I provided the evidence for that. And therefore, measuring it may be futile, almost futile, because the amount of cholesterol in your blood does say something about other aspects of your health, but not necessarily whether you're laying down plaque or not. And I may do a subsequent video about this topic as well. What causes cholesterol to rise to begin with. And so after that, I talked about better tests or markers of cardiovascular disease. So it's better to test markers of inflammation, of coagulation, and endothelial or blood vessel function. And so to test those, you can test for inflammation, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP. And inflammation brings about coagulation and scarring of the arteries, and that can be determined by measuring fibrinogen, the enzyme fibrinogen. And of course, if that process persists, then it damages the artery wall. And so it is possible to evaluate that through a urine albumin to creatinine ratio. It tests endothelial or blood vessel function. But to treat cardiovascular disease successfully, it will be useful to figure out what might cause it. So let's look at a few potential causes. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea as to how to address it. And so potential sources of inflammation are nutritional or chemical or environmental. And really, ultimately, they're all chemical in nature, right? Even food ingredients are chemical in nature. So let's explore that. So here is one example of nutritional cause, right? And I speak about this a lot, vegetable oil. And if you haven't heard me talk about this and how vegetable oil can cause cardiovascular disease and harm the arteries and cause plaque buildup in the arteries, then I have some information on my website in that regard. You can go read it there, drkleinhealth.com. Basically, vegetable oil is rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids. Types of fatty acids are very reactive. They cause oxidative stress, free radical damage, and damage the blood vessels. Another example, this time environmental causes, and there are many toxins out there, environmental toxins that can be detrimental. But one example is dioxins. Dioxins basically is a category of environmental toxins, and there are several of them, there are actually many of them, that are byproducts of industry, and their backbone is what you see here, that structure of 3 hexagonal rings, typically bound to chlorines, a lot of different chlorines and other molecules as well. And they're toxic. They accumulate in the body, and they actually accumulate in the body mostly through food. And indeed, research has shown that they are associated with cardiovascular mortality. So this is one example of a study, and you can see the conclusion. It says the results of this systemic review suggest that dioxin exposure is associated with mortality from IHD, which is ischemic heart disease, and all cardiovascular diseases, mostly ischemic heart disease. So it can actually harm the blood vessels around the heart, causing blockages there and contributing to heart attack and strokes. It's a little tricky with dioxins because there aren't a lot of good direct tests to measure them, but we know, for example, dioxins can deplete vitamin A, for example, vitamin A being an important nutrient, also an antioxidant. Perhaps increasing vitamin A through the diet can protect against dioxins, and also increasing antioxidants would help with that. Like vitamin E has been shown to help protect against those, and others as well. Another example of something that might cause cardiovascular inflammation and plaque buildup in the arteries is basically reactive metals. So heavy metals and things like iron as well. Perhaps iron is the most common culprit as far as metals go, although other metals like mercury and arsenic and lead and cadmium can also contribute to that as well. And there are different sources for these types of metals. So it's relatively easy to test for these. relatively. Not all metals can be tested in equal way. Um, Sometimes tissue levels are more significant than blood levels, and blood levels don't always relate to tissue levels. So there are different ways of doing that. As far as iron goes, you can test for iron in the blood, but more specifically, you would look for it in proteins that accumulate in tissues like ferritin. You would look at iron saturation and other markers that are related to iron metabolism. And so basically, iron is very reactive. And how can you tell if iron is accumulating in your body? And indeed, over the years, it accumulates in everybody's bodies and is not disposed of very easily. It's one of the stubborn metal, just keeps on accumulating in the body over time. As its levels increase, it can potentially cause harm. And so basically, look for brown spots on the skin or aging spots, which are basically a mixture of metals and polyunsaturated fatty acids, the kinds of fatty acids you get from vegetable oil. Now, of course, those brown spots can be a mixture of different types of metals and these oils as they accumulate in tissues. And of course, skin is a tissue, and you can see it on the skin. You cannot see it inside the body. But again, iron being the most common one, and the most common source of iron in our diet is actually not meat or red meat, which is rich in iron and is known as the richest source of iron. It's actually baked goods, breads and pastries and so on, because flour in North America and other countries as well is enriched with iron. Actually, iron shavings, not a very good thing. So perhaps limiting the intake of these things can be helpful. And there are ways to also not only limit the intake of iron, but also ways to try to get rid of it. Can look at donating blood every now and then if you qualify, if your health is good, and so on. But there are other ways as well to protect against iron accumulation. Yeah. And another example, an important one, is toxins that don't come from the outside, but come from the inside. Endotoxin from the gut. And so under conditions of stress, all kinds of stress, can be mental, emotional stress, but can also be chemical and physical stress. And I won't get into all that right now. But in general, stress can affect the gastrointestinal tract in such a way that it slows down its motility. And of course, the gut has bacteria, especially the large intestines has a lot of bacteria in it. Small intestines are generally free of bacteria, generally relatively sterile. But the reduction in motility causes bacteria to move up from the large intestines to the small intestines. And the stress that causes that also increases the permeability, the gap between the cells that line the intestinal wall. So that allows for bacterial byproducts to penetrate through the gut wall and move into the circulation. They are known as endotoxin or lipopolysaccharides, but don't mean to confuse you or make it sound too out of reach. Let's call it endotoxin. It's simple word, endo from within, toxin. And that endotoxin can interact with blood vessels and cause inflammation. And not only that, but serotonin, 95% of serotonin, the feel-good hormone, we're told it's feel-good hormone, it's a stress hormone. And I made another presentation about that, presented it on a couple of occasions in live settings. Maybe I should upload it to the channel. It's a bit dry and boring, but interesting if you're interested in the topic. But anyway, serotonin too can cause scarring of tissues, including scarring of the blood vessels, and contribute to the type of damage that results in plaque buildup as well. So addressing that would be super important if, that is a situation that might cause inflammation. So there are ways to test for it. A bit complicated, and I won't talk about it right now. And the last example is of chemical toxin is medications. Paradoxically, medications that we take to help for the purpose of getting better. Different types of medications can actually contribute to inflammation, to harm. And so, for example, and again, paradoxically, cholesterol-lowering medications, which are designed to try to help protect you against cardiovascular disease, when taken over a long period of time at a high dose, we know that they can contribute to diabetes. And of course, diabetes is closely associated with what? With cardiovascular disease, increased risk for cardiovascular events, heart attacks, and stroke if it's not treated properly. Of course, can also cause Alzheimer's, which is type 3 diabetes, and can potentially harm the kidneys, reduce kidney function. And as I mentioned in a previous video when I talked about the urine test, and I explained the rationale behind that, kidneys are highly vascular, and so it just proved that they can harm, these types of medications can harm the vasculature potentially. Other types of medications, commonly prescribed medications, are blood pressure medications, especially beta blockers like metoprolol, bisoprolol. They can be really useful short term. They can be really useful for things like treating tremors short term, maybe Parkinson's, things like that, Parkinson's-like symptoms short term. But long term use of beta blockers can potentially cause heart failure, reduce a lot of different functions, the ability of cells to produce energy, and so on. Again, it's a whole lot of, it's a big topic that I won't explore in details right now. But just as another example, I talked about serotonin. Well, the medications that raise serotonin in the body, SSRIs, serotonin, medications are given for depression. Just by virtue of increasing serotonin, as I mentioned earlier, can also contribute to inflammation in the arteries and cardiovascular disease. And another common example is non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So things like ibuprofen, naproxen. In the short run, they reduce inflammation. In the long run, they might actually exacerbate, make inflammation worse. So how we determine all these things? It's a bit like detective work, right? It's about doing a proper evaluation, understanding the medical history, understanding what's going on with a person, getting the right tests based on that information, and then moving forward to treat the person based on the information that has been revealed through proper evaluation. And then you'll have, then you need to take steps to deal with it accordingly. And so what I do in terms of treating clients with these sort of issues is I take steps to protect against inflammation, so reduce the inflammation, facilitate detoxification when that's required, and often it is, and then fortify and heal the tissues. And of course, different natural medicines and dietary regimens and lifestyle regimens can work towards that effect. So if you need a different direction with your healthcare, then feel free to reach out. You can go to my website, Dr. Klein Health, and just fill the form and ask for a conversation. We can have a chat and see if indeed I could help you. And if you like this type of information, you found it valuable, then please do share the information, like the video, and subscribe so that this information can reach more individuals that might benefit from it. Thank you very much for watching.